10x your service design offering with Smaply. Take 20% off any order with This Is HCD 20 off. Let's superpower you and your design team's potential. Sign up at smaply.app. Enjoy the episode from your friends at Smaply, helping support This Is HCD podcast.
John Boot is a well-known figure in EU data centre circles, primarily for his role as a reviewer of the EU Code of Conduct for data centres and his work with the Certified Energy Efficiency Data Centre Award. I started by asking John if he thinks data centres are doing enough to conserve energy, water and materials in this time of crisis. I gave an example of a 2021 survey which found that 63% of data centre managers thought there is no business justification for collecting water usage data.
In the past, I would absolutely 100% agree with you. I don't think data centres are doing enough to conserve energy, materials and water. But there are things changing at an EU level. There are a number of pieces of legislation that are due to come into force over the next 2 to 3 years, which I think will focus their minds very much on the conservation of energy, materials and water.
That's good to hear. And John, I've been involved, and you've been involved, I'm sure as well, in the tech industry. I've been involved since the mid-90s. And one thing that struck me, and I think I was very much part of it as well, I change my computer every 2 years. I never really thought about materials. I never really thought about waste. I never really thought, either I bought into the idea that a kind of digital was immaterial, or I just didn't care. Or, and I would be in large organizations and see this, they change equipment at a whim. There was very little culture of, let's say, conservation. It was in the culture of technology. Is that, would you agree or disagree that, the classical technologist is not a conservationist by a kind of cultural thinking?
Yeah, and I think what we have here is something that we describe in green IT circles as the vicious circle. So what you end up doing is, somebody creates a really large data drive with lots more data on it, and then the software developers fill up that data drive with all sorts of extraneous code, and then the hardware manufacturers seem to feel that they need to create an even smaller or larger disk drive, and it just goes on and on and on. And you can't stop technology. The amount of chips or transistors on a chip has increased exponentially from over the last 40, 50 years. And we can do a lot more data processing for the same energy that we were doing lots and lots of processing many years ago. And it has led to a proliferation of data and data storage and the manipulation of data. But I think that time is coming to an end. Moore's law has effectively died. Until we move to a different type of chip material, such as graphene, we're treading water basically in terms of that.
Yeah, and just for the casual reader or listener, would you explain Moore's law?
Moore's law is effectively was created by a technologist called Moore's law. I believe he worked for Intel, and he specified that the amount of chips or transistors on a chip would double every 2 years or 1 year, and then he extended it to 2 years. And we have kind of reached the theoretical limits of Moore's law at present. And as I said, we will only get more power from a chip if we move to a new type of material.
And just back on the other point you raised about the absolute, explosion, and it's that circle, of manufacturers and software gets bigger, so manufacturer devices need to get bigger, etc. But the quantity of data that's resulting from that, and what I've seen in most of my experience in working with large organizations over the years, is that the vast majority of data, 90 to 95% that gets created, does not actually get used or is only used for a couple of weeks, or basically 2 or 3 months after it's stored. Nobody ever goes back to it. So we're getting this huge bulging explosion of data that in many ways the poor quality or low level or stuff that we're not going to go back to is going to, override the quality stuff. In my experience, there's less information architecture skills today than there was 20 years ago. There's less of, people have essentially given up, and kind of the hope is that artificial intelligence or some other technology will help understand the data. But it's like there's this tsunami of data, and organizations have in many cases just been incapable and given up in the very idea of managing it.
I would absolutely agree with you. I call that sort of data frivolous data. It's pictures of cats dancing on Facebook and jokes that come around and all that sort of stuff. And I actually, when I speak about this at various events, I've got a slide of a picture of a dinner that somebody had in a restaurant. And I asked the audience, I say, 30 years ago, I didn't take a Polaroid of my Sunday lunch and bring it to the pub on Sunday evening and show all my mates what I had to eat. So why do people think that it's necessary and something that they should be doing now? And that's just basically user education. But photographs are personal things. They're developed, taken by people for memories. And yes, it is true that a lot of that data is never seen again, or, in maybe 2 years' time when they're looking back through their file to see what photographs were taken. And it's very difficult to take something away from somebody. It's the whole photographic industry is now digital. Back in the day, you'd take your film, you'd take your canister to the processing company. They would process it, and then they would send you a couple of days later a pack of photographs, and you look through them, and you'd probably discard the ones you didn't want and keep the ones you did, and then you'd put them away somewhere safe to look back through it later on. I mean, my mother passed away 2 years ago, and we've got a lot of her stuff at the house, and there is a box of photographs. Am I going to look through them? Probably not. I shall put them into storage. So people do store stuff that they don't need. But in this case, it does have an energy storage element. So we should be a little bit more circumspect about what we keep and what we discard. Going back into data, and you talked about AI using that data. I think a lot of companies feel that some of the data they've collected over their operations is useful. There may be a little nugget in there that can help them shape their strategy for moving forward, or it could provide some extra input into a bid or a project that they're working on. And that's why they don't want to get rid of it. But I think what we'll see in the future is there will be people who will probably be known as data destroyers or data analysis scientists that will look through that data and go, is this useful to the business? No. Right, let's get rid of it then. But, we're not there yet. But I think the climate emergency and the cost of storage, especially with the energy price increases across Europe recently, it is definitely something that the question needs to be asked, and the management needs to put steps in place to deal with it.
You said there a little bit about the photos, and I've done some analysis of photos. Last year, we took roughly 1.4 trillion photos. So we took more photos than in the entire 20th century. And I was talking to this really interesting Australian who's she basically helps people, families and things, manage their photos. And she's talking about concepts like, waiting for the right moment, that we need to retrain or develop senses of, rather than click, 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 to really wait for the right moment, and then to have habits of, after you've taken photos, to immediately go over them, in the process, and then immediately half of them will say, "Oh, that's horrible. I don't want that one. Don't want that one." But if you wait until you've got 25,000 on your phone, you just won't go back in the process. And I think the same in organizational data. I see a lot of organizations I deal with simply overwhelmed by the quantity of data that they're producing. And it's like the nugget becomes a nugget in a vastly bigger pile of clay and rock. And the rock and the clay gets 10 times bigger every year. So finding that nugget becomes harder because of the sheer quantity of data that's being produced.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with you. And, data mining is not a new concept. It's been around since kind of like the late 90s. And you're right, it is, we are going through a lot of stuff. And it's human nature, though. People need to think, is this actually data that we need to keep and record for posterity? And we do need to be a little bit more, I'm going to call it brutal, actually, in what we keep and what we don't keep.
Connected with organizational data as well, one thing's that area that I've been working on, the web connected with that, web analytics. In my experience, most web analytics and tracking data, and it's problematic to begin with from privacy point of views. In the vast majority of organizations, that has very little value of how many people visited yesterday, how many pages did they look at, how much time did they spend on a page, and tons of other analytics that I have found most web teams really struggle to actually get any useful insights out of this data. So often we're getting flooded by types of data that there's an internal feeling or need that, we need to analyze this, we need to be looking at this. And yet an awful lot of this organizational data does not actually lead to good insights or useful insights, but there is the feeling that, we need to be tracking people. Most websites don't need to track people because there's really not all that reason. And maybe you disagree with me, but it's just my experience that I've been at so many Monday morning meetings analyzing the analytics data, and it was like a type of theater, people pretending to say intelligent things, but really nothing happening as a result of those conversations. What will we do? Will we delete that page? Will we keep it? Will we rewrite it? No real positive actions, but this kind of data theater going on in so many organizations.
That's a really great term, actually, data theater. And I would absolutely agree with you. We are collecting data for data's sake. And I think if you move to something like the Internet of Things, and I'll give you an example. So we work with a couple of organizations, and some of them were quite proud to tell me that they're collecting 1,440 data points a day on temperature of a certain item in a certain data center. And you think, well, why are you recording 1,440 data points? The temperature variations are so minute. Really, what you want to be looking at is saying, okay, you look through the data and you go, right, so for 1,420 of those data points that you've collected, the temperature was 23 degrees. Why not consolidate it and go, right, the average temperature of that particular item in that particular data center was 23 degrees, and shrink it down to one data point or two data points. So only look at the actual things where it's gone out of a certain system boundary, and then analyze that, and only keep what you actually need in order to determine why that temperature rose, what was actually happening for that temperature to rise. And I think they kind of agree with me. It's just that it's the logic of looking at that daily data and then shrinking it down. And sometimes it's just easier to keep it in their minds. But I asked that question and say, so why have we got 1,440 points where it says that the temperature was 23.2 degrees? And they kind of look at me as if to say, well, we don't know. So I mean, it's quite interesting, that point of view. I think it's, we as a people have kind of forgotten what data is, and we're hoarding data for no real reason. And it's something that we need to think about. Now, I do know that there are a number of organizations that I'm involved with that are looking at the actual coding of software. And it's a very good philosophy that they put forward. So they talk about the moon landings in 1969, and they say, the computer that was running all that was very limited in its storage space, and the code was very limited in its storage space. So just act in your coding like you have got a barrier that you cannot go over, and to shrink what you're actually getting the chips to do. And by the same token, you go, we haven't got enough space to keep it, what I call frivolous data. So you have to be circumspect. You have to have an annual spring clean or an autumn clean and go through and go, right, is that useful? Yes, I'll keep it. Is that useful? No. Right, let's get rid. I think, as I said earlier, the energy costs of storing data are going to rise across Europe at least. And those conversations will need to be had, and they'll need to be had at senior level. And a decision will have to come down from high to say, right, let's look at the data. Let's see what's useful. Let's see what's not useful, and take steps to get rid, or convert it into tape drives or CDs and put it into physical storage. And that is another green IT concept of hot, warm, cold, and frozen data. So hot data is data that you access, within a month, and then it would move to warm. Warm data is stuff that you may have looked at over 6 months. Cold data is data that you haven't looked at for a year, and frozen data is stuff that you haven't looked at in 2 years. And you can change those variables if you want. If you consider hot data to be a week, then that's the prerogative of the company. But the idea is to make it really difficult to access that cold and frozen data by taking it off the system, so that people that want to use it have to put a special request into their IT service team in order for somebody to go and retrieve the physical medium and bring it back in and put it on. And of course, a CD or a tape doesn't use any energy. A data center in an enterprise can be using up to 40% of the energy that the entire enterprise uses. And of course, that varies depending on what type of business your business is actually in. And quite rightly, I think the financial directors are going, well, what is my data center doing? And the IT directors have been going, well, it supports the business, and you can't really, start to ask us to do any reductions because we're supporting the business. But what I think is going to happen in future is they're going to go, well, yeah, okay, but how are you supporting the business? What are you doing that is so integral, which is costing me this much money? We are using energy prices going up affects all organizations. But if you've got a high ICT focused organization, then clearly the cost of the ICT system and its data center and all of its supporting infrastructure is going to affect how that business works. Now, I'm not advocating cutting to the bone, but, in recessionary times and when times are tight, that's exactly what does happen. And, people are going to go look at the data center and go, you are using 40% of my energy. And I don't know what metrics you're using to justify that you are using 40% of my energy. We need to start to look at what we're doing. Is there any quick wins, easy wins that we can adopt, even moving forward to more detailed measures or actions you can take to really reduce your ICT stack, but still continue to support the business. I think, one of the things that always amazes me is, let's take, for instance, the latest Windows, right? I mean, I haven't looked, to be honest, but it must be terabytes or at least, gigabytes of information that's stored. And you look at the average user, and most users don't use half of the facilities that are available on the operating systems. So you think, why can't we do something about that? Can we not reduce stuff a little bit more, get rid of this over ambitious coding, reduce the amount of data storage that's required? But it's a bit like Pandora's box, Gerry. Once you open it, you can't give something to somebody and expect them not to use it and then take it away from them.
Certainly take it away in its entirety, but maybe as you've outlined, and this growing maturity of and these crises that we're hitting as well. There's maybe, I remember reading about the history of sugar, and that the sugar consumption in most countries peaked in the 70s, and it has been in at least not a radical decline, but somewhat of a decline, because we got too much of a good thing in a way, and then we realized that it had a lot of negative side effects. But in the industry, and I think this is broadly true, whether it is the private cloud or the private data center world or the public cloud, like you mentioned about the IT managers, and I would have found the exact same kind of culture of the CIO, that there is a feeling that the more tech we have, the more data we have, the more the organization is dependent on us, and the more important we seem. So, having lots of data is good for my career, so to speak. And then in the public cloud, it's, well, we'll bring them in with free plans or cheap, and then we'll tier it upwards and make lots of profit from it. So there's a kind of a negative incentive within data centers to encourage the growth of data. Like, there's no real incentives in a data center management culture to have less data.
Yeah. Well, let me just clarify something here, right? So a data center, there are three different types of data centers. One is an enterprise data center, and within that type of data center, the whole operation is owned and managed by one organization. And then we have co-location type data centers who provide hosting services for multiple organizations. And these may be where their existing facility has run out of power, space, or cooling, and they need to find some other location to host their physical infrastructure. And then we have the cloud guys, the hyperscalers. Now, effectively, these guys are all enterprise guys because they own and operate their own facilities, but they also have points of presence in co-location data centers. And it would be wrong to say that the data center is at fault here. It's the cloud provider that is providing all of these services. And, the cloud is hugely important at the moment. It helped us through pandemic. It allows higher energy efficiency to occur because you're using virtualization techniques. So many companies will be using the same physical platform, which therefore means that they don't have to provide that physical infrastructure and run the energy on it. And if you were to look at how much enterprise compute is now in the cloud, there should be a corresponding reduction in on-prem data centers. And that is actually happening. Now, unfortunately, what's happening is that although the compute is moving, the guys that are running their enterprise data centers aren't then moving on and reducing what they need in terms of their supporting infrastructure. So they're still maintaining the same temperature aspects for a vastly reduced ICT estate. And this is the kind of customer we work with. So we kind of say to them, right, you've just moved 50% of your IT equipment into the cloud, but you haven't made the corresponding 50% reduction in your cooling power. And maybe you need to think about shrinking that size of that facility. And so I think we're in a kind of transition period. People will start to be looking at their enterprise facilities once they've moved into the cloud, and we will see the corresponding energy savings. And this, the headline kind of data centers use 2, 3, 4% of global energy use. But how much does ICT use that is not in a data center? And when I say not in a data center, I mean the server cupboards, the small 50 rack data centers, stuff that we don't consider to be a data center. The name data center has changed its kind of meaning, and now we kind of mean it to be 100 megawatt hyperscale, Amazon, Google, Meta, Facebook, etc., all those guys. And that's absolutely not the case. In fact, only 15% of our enterprise ICT is in the cloud. So there's 85% of it. It's still in poorly managed on-site data centers where, and I call it the tragedy of the commons, where the people that are running those facilities are not data center professionals. They are IT people that just happen to have a data center under their control. And they very rarely go to the big trade events. They very rarely see what products and techniques and concepts that are available for them to reduce their energy consumption. And, they just can't apply some of the more onerous energy efficiency measures that you can take. And they're the big problem at the moment, I think. There's a lot of, and the thing is, we don't know who they are because we're not measuring them. But for instance, in the UK, we have something called the Climate Change Agreement. And the Climate Change Agreement is for commercial data centers. And this is mostly the co-location guys. And from recent, the fourth period of the Climate Change Agreement data centers, it was just over 3.8 million tons of CO2 that was allocated the emissions. And that actually corresponds to close to 12 terawatt hours of all UK generation in that period, that 2-year period, which is actually around 4% of the UK's energy use. But it still doesn't include the likes of BT. It doesn't include Sky's content delivery networks. It doesn't cover any distributed IT. So I think if we start looking at it from that point of view, we are vastly underestimating our data center energy use. And it's almost impossible to find. Now, you remember earlier I said that there's EU legislation coming in that I think is going to focus the minds of data center operators and enterprise data center operators. And it will do, because we're effectively, they are asking for information and they bring in the actual, the bar to report down to 50 kilowatts. And that is exceptionally low, and it is going to pull all of those smaller data centers together. So once that exercise is done, in Europe, at least the 27 member states, we will have excellent visibility of our distributed IT. And who knows what will happen then? Now, I'm not going to preempt or suggest anything to the Commission as to what they could do, but,
But if you had to, what would you say?
Well, there are policy measures that can take place, and it's like any government can use instruments to change behaviour, and one of them may well be, although it wouldn't be, to my mind, a viable solution, was to operate on the PUE metric and say that if your data centre is above 1.5, then you have to take steps to reduce it to below 1.5. And of course, that may mean that because it's a legacy facility, it may be very difficult to do that. But there might be a carrot and there may be a stick. St. Mary's, you can operate a 1.7 PUE data center, but you're going to get fined for being over 1.7.
And if you could just explain that metric, please, just for...
Yeah, so the PUE metric is actually, it's much misaligned. Even within the industry, I don't think there are many people that actually understand what it means, but it's the total energy that goes into a data center divided by the amount of energy that's used by the IT equipment. So in effect, it's a ratio of how much energy is going in, which includes the cooling, power, smoothing, ancillary services, against how much actual energy is used for the IT. So the theoretical minimum is 1, but we have data centers operating in Europe that are probably close to 3, 4, 5, 6 because they're over-engineered.
One thing that I've found over the years is, I don't know how to put it, the inefficiency of the IT department, or the lack of, like in many cases when we were tracking the quantity of data in an organization, many IT departments I dealt with didn't even know how many servers they had, let alone how much data they had. That there was huge inefficiency, but that then comparing that inefficiency, say, to the cloud, what I found in the cloud in a lot of environments is you get 2x efficiency, but then you store 6x the data because it becomes so much easier to store the data. There's great efficiency in the production and the storage of the data that we kind of, I think it's called the Jevons paradox or whatever. We eat up the efficiency by storing way, way more than we would have originally stored in the more inefficient environment.
One thing that, I often find is I say to them, are you operating the IT information library, ITIL? And they'll go, yes. And I say, well, can I have a look at your service catalogue then, please? And they hum and ha, and they then don't produce the ITIL service catalog, and I'll kind of say, right, okay, so tell me about how do you manage your IT estate? What project management are you adopting within this organization? And the reason for that is that, and I'm not going to name them, but I went to one a couple of years ago, and I said, oh, that looks an interesting brand new stack of IT equipment in that rack. And he said, yeah, that's the new system for X. And he said, and over there on that rack is the old system for X. And then he said, and over there is the even older system for X. And you kind of go, right, so if you'd adopted Prince 2, there is a decommissioning piece in the Prince 2 process, and there's also a lessons learned. And then in the ITIL catalog, that there should be an historical element which talks about what services there are in your organization at the moment, including the recent stuff. So what we've got here is a situation where there is management tools that are available, and the nature of IT projects is that once the project is done, nobody's going to turn off the old system, because you never know, you might need to go back to it because the new system might fail. And then a couple of weeks later, the project team disbands, and you've got this system sitting there in your data center, still on, taking up power and network resources. And it is expensive, I think in the Eureka project, we estimated that it was £14,000 per annum to keep one server up and running, including all the software and the licensing aspects of it. And it's a zombie server. It's just sitting there doing nothing. And, the Uptime Institute have identified that up to 40% of servers in enterprises in the US could be zombie servers.
And that I talked to, you just remind me of a conversation I had with an enterprise architect a while ago, and he'd spent 30 or 40 years in the IT industry. And he says he'd never been in an organization, not once that he could remember, where he couldn't remove 90% of the IT architecture and make that organization run better.
And we've seen this, this high movement to the cloud. And I think what's happening is that people are seeing the cloud as the silver bullet, that it will help them with their IT problems. But I don't think they are, because of the way that they're actually moving their services into the cloud. They're not performing a kind of overall analysis of why we have got that particular application and its physical hardware. Why are we moving something that's already zombie into the cloud? In the past, I've done a lot of data center migrations. And I'll give you one example. So we were moving a customer from one data center into another data center. And we had a team of guys there. And I think we shifted about 400 items. So we basically would consolidate. We were doing all that work, bringing the server in after it had been packed, unpacking it, put it in the rack, connecting up to the network, etc. And there was this one particular machine that the client said, "Oh, it's not working." Okay, all right then. So I went off and I replaced virtually every single component in that machine except for the disk, and I was still getting the dreaded NT loader not present or correct. And at the end of the day, I went to see the client and I said, "Right, everything's done. There's just this one particular box that's it's evaded all attempts for me to repair it." And he went, "Oh, I don't know why we moved that. It's never worked." And you think, how many hours did I spend trying to get that machine working when it didn't work and it shouldn't have been there? And to come back to what we were saying, organizations need to do a deep spring clean on their own facilities, even if it's just to reduce their energy bill. That would be a good start. And then once they've done the spring clean, it's going to help them, rationalize and sort out their entire IT infrastructure, and probably free up lots of resources, network capacity, power capacity in their existing facilities. And then they can go to internal clouds. They can build internal cloud structures themselves. And then they need to be, proper gatekeepers on the storage. You only put this data in there if it's useful to the organization. The thing is, Gerry, the tools are out there. It now needs the internal will of the executive directors to implement the green IT and energy efficiency requirements, because the cloud's not going away. The cloud is going to be there. It's integral to the way that the world works at the moment. But it does need to be improved. And I'm sure, and I know through conversations I've had with my clients, that they want to be, they don't want to be sitting there carrying instant, data that's frivolous. They want to be seen as addressing the climate crisis. They want to be seen as being efficient. And it's just, what does it take? Do energy prices have already quadrupled. If you think about, and there's another example. So back in the night, I'm old enough to remember the 1973 oil crisis. I was only a nipper at the time. But my dad used to literally moan at me if I left the light on in my room. And that habit has stayed with me till today. If I'm in a room, I only turn the light on when I enter the room, and I turn the light off when I leave the room. And maybe that kind of mentality has to be cascaded down.
And just connected with it, related, or I think it's related at least, is this obsession, in my experience, with the latest, greatest processor. So it's not just storage of data, it's processing. And I find that there's a lot of unnecessary processing, or that organizations will change, their processing, if the latest gizmo and it only has 0.0001% improvement, they'll go for it and they'll get rid of perfectly good working equipment, or the broad obsession with I must have the Ferrari of processing every time, even though I don't really need it for the job that's there, but I really want to say that I have the latest and greatest and mega processing. So we're often throwing, processing that is hundreds of times greater than is what is necessary for the problem at hand.
Absolutely. But I think that's changing. So we've had recent news that I think it's Google are extending the lives of their servers from 3 years to 5 years. I think Facebook or Meta have done the same. Amazon are definitely going to be sweating their assets. Now, I don't think they're doing this for altruistic reasons or for energy efficiency reasons. I think they're doing it because of the shortage of chips. So they're basically sweating their assets a bit longer. And this is a well-known green IT concept as well. It's, if something works, if it's not broke, don't fix it. Let it continue to do what it needs to do. And up until recently, Moore's law would have kind of pointed you towards changing it out because you are getting more processing power for every kilowatt of energy. But as we mentioned earlier, the gains that you get from having the latest, greatest equipment are absolutely steadily diminishing. So there is no reason to go out and get the best phone or the best server in that class, unless you are in an environment where you've got an absolute need to be faster and better than everybody else. And for that is a very small niche of the banking sector, which is the high frequency trading element, where the processor will make a difference to your bottom line. But that's only like 0.5%, not even that. It's probably less than that of all, IT trading. So only those guys should do it. But of course, what will happen then is that, because it's such a small market, maybe the processors won't be increased on such a frequent basis. But the other thing to consider is that there is a whole ecosystem that's built up with developing faster, better chips and faster, better servers. Their business models are based on people replacing their equipment every 2 to 3 years. So, of course, if that time period gets extended, then obviously we're going to see the development side of things start to slow down as well. But,
which might be a good thing.
Well, I was just about to say, I think it would be a good thing because, as we said earlier, why have we got bloatware operating systems that are running all sorts of different and wonderful code that 99% of the people don't use? I sit here in front of my PC and I can tell you that I use probably 5 or 6 applications. I use Word to do documents. I use Excel to do spreadsheets and financial stuff. I use the internet to keep in touch with people, and I do podcasts. So I use Zoom and have meetings. I don't, I look through, I click on the old Windows button at the bottom of my PC, and I look through all of these services, and, I can tell you that there's at least 3/4 of them I've never ever used. Paint, 3D, PhoneLink, photos. I've got some photos. Publisher, never use it. Skype, it's on there. I've never used it. I don't use it anymore. Spotify, never use it. Sticky notes, I never use it. These applications shouldn't be embedded into the operating system. They should be specific requests by the user to use them. And that would reduce the amount of stuff needed.
I almost feel it physically pains me when I hear this about hard drives that are okay and working being physically trashed, for security reasons. And I understand it, and it's the irony, isn't it, of our world, our digital world. We're constantly told, "Oh, you got to keep multiple copies because it's so unstable," and then you're told, you got to physically trash this because you can never really 100% get rid of it. That surely, this we can change that where we don't need to physically destroy something. A server can have caused between 1 and 2 tons of CO2 to manufacture. And, that physical destruction of something that is working in a climate crisis where material impact of mining is absolutely huge on the planet, it's not a good look for the IT industry.
And I think what annoys me more and more is that they are absolutely just shredded. And I don't know what they're actually doing with the component materials. And I think that's another problem that the IT manufacturers need to address, is the recyclability of those components. Now, I know the right of repair has just come into EU legislation, and that will no doubt trigger a lot of angst within the manufacturing community. And I do recall being on a NSF, which is part of the Energy Star, as an observer, and seeing a draft for server makeup. And at the time, there was a requirement for 85% of the server components to be recyclable. And there was a massive pushback from the manufacturing companies that they wouldn't and couldn't do 85%. And, they really did water them down, the actual requirements.
The stats that I have done, and this is globally, not in electronics in general, not just servers, is that less than 20% globally recycled. And even what is recycled, no more than about 30% of reusable materials retrieved, because of the sheer complexity of the material design of the products, that you just can't, when you get the copper or whatever, you lose the other stuff by the process you've used.
It's an absolutely massive problem. And e-waste, as it's called, which includes IT equipment, but also things like fridges and cookers and bread makers and microwaves and old coffee machines. It's growing on a absolutely phenomenal basis. And I think the problem is that these companies to date have not really worried about the aftermath. And we do have a kind of use it and dispose of it mentality. We don't tend to keep things on. There is an inherent 5-year replacement cycle for kitchen items, for instance. And that's a business model that kind of wants you to keep buying. I'll just give an example. Very recently, our 5-year-old washing machine literally blew up. And we had to go out and buy a new one. Now, I would have much preferred to have got it repaired, but I said to my wife, how much would it be to get somebody to look at it? She said, well, it'll be £100 just for him to turn up at the door. And then if you find something wrong with it and he has to wait, and all the time the washing's mounting up in the house, it's cheaper and easier just to go to the shop and buy a new one and get it delivered. And that's what we did. But I think that business model is kind of, it's doomed to failure in these resource restricted times. Energy prices going up means that the embodied carbon in a device is going to be up. The right to repair legislation from the European Union means that those items need to be repairable. And we're going to see, I think, hopefully, we'll start to see items that are designed to last 10, 15, 20 years, but also be able to be modular in nature, so that you can basically take a component out and put a new component in and get that done. And there are other industries that do this. Refurbished gearboxes and engines, for instance, can be purchased from the motor manufacturers. Look at what happened with the motor manufacturers. I remember going to breakers yards when I had, a 1975 Triumph Dolomite, and finding old Triumph Dolomites in a very precarious kind of breakers yard situation, and you kind of took your life in your hands to go and recover some of the items because the cars were just basically chucked in a big pile. Nowadays, if you go to a breakers yard, you don't even go onto the onto the area where the cars are, because they've got people working in there that are taking out all of the, the value, the useful items, and bagging them up and putting them in a storeroom. You go in and go, I need a shock absorber for a Triumph or whatever, Ford Fiesta, and the guy will go, there you go, 50 quid, please. You don't go out and do your own kind of break-in now. It's all become a lot more professional. And why did that happen? Because the EU put a law in place saying motor vehicles need to be 85% recyclable.
The vast majority of websites that I know of or interacted with do not need 99.9% uptime and the same equivalent for data. And I think this pursuit of absolute, a kind of obsession with a perfectionist metric of, we will be on all this 99.99% of time, because a lot of that drives, we have to get rid of the server after 3 years, even if it's working, because of the statistical chance that it might cause a flaw after 3.5 years. That, maybe these metrics of that, how we measure, we could say, just like you said earlier, a lot of data can be frozen or cold. A lot of data doesn't always have to be doesn't have to be even in this cloud environment, can comfortably deal with 90% or 95%. And if you had those lesser standards, the equipment could last a lot longer.
Okay, so I think this is down to risk and the risk appetite of organisations. It's something that I've actually included in an impending building sustainable data centres course that we plan to deliver next year. And it's basically saying to people, what is your perception of risk? Why are you building these facilities with these multiple layers of security and these multiple backups of everything? What is it you're actually trying to protect? Now, I'll give you an example. When I worked for a rather large systems integrator, I was seconded into a retailer's, and we used to get basically requests from the business unit to provide IT equipment, and we had a kind of a spreadsheet that we would use in order to do that. So the guy, the architecture was X different service of this, and a bit of storage array there, and then there was this, and there was networking and all that sort of stuff. And I said to him, right, so what do you want? He said, I want an all singing, all dancing, 24/7, 365, totally resilient approach. I was okay. So we worked it out on the spreadsheet, which somebody else had done. So I hadn't had any input into the way this, and it came out. It was close on £750,000 to provide the hardware for this particular service. And I said that to him, and he looked at it in shock, and he said, "Well, this is far. This exceeds my budget completely." And I said, "Well, you've asked for an all singing, all dancing, 24/7, 365 solution. What you need to do now is to work out whether or not you actually need those services 24/7, 365, because I think you'll find that you probably don't." And I think it's an education piece for IT architects as well. And it's also pushing back on the business. It's like saying to the business, why do you need this service up for all of that length of time? Do you need this disaster recovery, business continuity element? Would you, can you accept a service being down for 3 hours during the day until it can be recovered? What actual impact is that going to have on the business unit itself? And I think one of the, and this is why I continually go back to the code of conduct for data centers energy efficiency and the use of its best practices as a strategic and cultural change tool. You need to ask those questions. Now, what I would do in that particular retail environment, I was actually asked to do business continuity and disaster recovery. And I went round and spoke to every single business unit and said, what do you consider to be your absolutely must-have application that's always available 24/7, 365? And funnily enough, when I asked the guy, the IT director, he said, "Oh, C-suite email." And I just looked at him with this incredulous look on my face and said, "Really? Email?" And he said, "Yeah." And I said, "What? So what? The senior management team can't pick up phones? Or they can't walk into the next guy's office on the same floor that they're all on? Why would you consider C-suite email as being your priority one application? Your priority one applications are things that are related to the business. So in your case, it is your EPOS system, electronic point of sale, so that when people come into your stores, they can select the goods that they want to do and pay for them, which puts money in your bank. But more importantly, it also marks a link on the logistics system so that the logistics system knows that that item has been sold and it can restock it. So those are your two most important applications, getting the money in and your supply chain. C-suite email, my friend, is a lot lower down the list. And I think what companies should do, or IT directors should do, they should do the audit. They should work out exactly what applications they're providing to the business and then the physical hardware that it's running on. And then they need to say, right, what actual business continuity, disaster recovery aspects do I need to apply to these facilities? And what they would do then is, they would go, right, in my data center, I'm going to have a tier 4 area, which is for the most critical of critical systems, being, in this case, the EPOS and the supply chain software, and then graduate down. So and you'd probably find actually that it would be one rack that would need to be at tier 4, which is the Uptime Institute classification for mission criticality, or an EN 5600 class 4. And then that most of your applications can probably be notched down a level because they're not mission critical. Yeah, okay, it's nice to have, but is it stopping me from doing my work? No. When it comes back up, I'll be able to do what I need to do. And I think the problem is that a lot of IT departments treat every single application that they have within their company as being mission critical, when actually it certainly isn't. But you can only do that if you are prepared to undertake that deep strategic and cultural analysis of your organization's IT stack and be prepared to make the decisions that will reduce your energy consumption and potentially reduce your procurement requirements. So instead of replacing your laptops or your desktops every 3 years, extend it to 5 years. It's a win-win-win for the organization. And what it will do is it will force the IT companies and all of their supply chain to really start to think about their business models, especially in line with the climate emergency.
In Ireland at the moment, data centres are consuming 14% of electricity and delivering 1,800 permanent jobs. So 1,800 jobs, 14% of Irish electricity. And from studying, and these are the big data centres, the hyperscale or whatever, that they're terrible essentially for the local community. They take the land, they take the energy, and they take the water locally. And they give very little back to the actual community. So the sense of the data center is not a good community member. In I saw this study in Paris which said, for if a store, a typical store would give 50 jobs, then the equivalent data center would give 1 job back to the community. And I don't know. I know it's a hard thing to ask a question about, but that sense of being a good, being a good local or community member for data centers, it's not something that they deliver a lot of value to the local community with.
Yeah, and I think I've been talking about this for some time. The sector itself, and because it's so fragmented and diverse, I think what we're going to refer to here is the hyperscalers and the co-location guys, what I would call the professional data center operators. It's a relatively new industry, Gerry. It really only became a viable business after the dot-com boom of the early 2000s. And effectively, it was to sell space and to recover the monies that had been spent on this dot-com boom and all of the infrastructure that was built for it. And it's funny, when you talk to the industry's professionals, and I do frequently go to every event that I can, and you talk to them, it's very clear that a lot of them they're engineers and technicians, and they are not that well kind of acquainted with the other functions such as HR, marketing, publicity, management. Really, it's still a very immature industry in certain respects, and they are in a huge growth spurt at the moment, right? And the industry globally is short of some 400,000 technical people, and that doesn't include, those administrative managerial roles that I think would come part of that business. It is changing. There are now people that can talk a good talk, but we're very bad as a sector of saying our message, which our message is, look, we are providing the digital infrastructure that modern day life relies on. Because the sector is staffed with people whose ability to get a good message across is limited because of the nature of their work background. These guys were installing cables, they were building panels, they were maintaining data centers. They weren't professional PR people, and they're not very good at getting that message across. But I think that's changing. And Gary Connolly, for instance, who's host for Ireland, he's doing a really good job at getting that message across. And Ireland, the problems in Ireland due to data centers are not due to data centers. The problems in Ireland that are impacting data centers are down to the fact that the government and EirGrid and all of those other elements, people, organisations, have not sufficiently taken on board what Gary has been telling them for the last 8 years or so, and they haven't met their side of the bargain. They haven't put in place the infrastructure that's required and developed the energy storage systems that are part of a new 21st grid infrastructure that can take renewables on board. So it is really the energy industry's problem in Ireland as to why data centres are perceived to be a problem. They are in effect deflecting the blame onto the data centres. But put it this way, if data centres account for 14%, who gave them the planning permission? Who should have been putting the infrastructure in place? And those are questions that need to be asked. But I don't think you can blame the data centres per se for being up at 14% of the grid and only employing. And I'd cast doubt on that 1,400 jobs as well, because there's probably, you need to think about the ecosystem. So it might be 1,400 direct jobs, but how many other jobs have been created by the fact that those data centers are there? And we have to consider this in the same way as we, for instance, could consider any major industry. It's the support services that are the servicing those industries, electromechanical guys. Think about, and this is sometimes not said, Gerry, but Irish subcontractors that are skilled in the construction of data centers are operating globally, right? And that is purely because they did so much work in data centers in Dublin, and they know they were seen to be a good workforce. They built stuff, and that element is very rarely mentioned. But you are exporting data center knowledge and construction globally, and that employs a lot more people than the 1,400 people you just mentioned.
Well, yeah, there's definitely that, but still, relatively speaking, I mean, Ireland's a small economy, but there's still 2.5 million employed, and it's the actual returns. And you said, yeah, the other jobs, but those jobs, that's the whole promise of the cloud. There is likely to be in Seattle or Hamburg. The Mead data center is not good for the Mead community, basically, because it takes the local people's water, it takes their electricity, it takes their land, and they might get a few cleaning jobs or security jobs there. That's it's not a good community prospect.
And I would say that, yes, you're probably right up to this point, but I think the data center sector has recognized that. And I know for a fact that we're working on a project in Portugal, and one of the elements from the sustainability and ESG elements is that they are creating a local college, and they are going to be taking school leavers through that college in order to give them the skills to work within the facility. And you could argue that that's, smacking of estate type, medieval kind of thing. But, if the people have the skills, and I know this, people that work for somebody like Amazon, they can get a job working in Dublin as a technician, and then they can apply for similar jobs anywhere on the Amazon estate. So they could go to the US and they can increase their knowledge, their skills, and get promoted and basically make a great career for themselves. And then they can move again. They can go to the Asia Pac region. They can go to India. They can experience all sorts of life. As I said earlier, the data center sector is very naive in terms of its maturity of its, it's a 22-year-old industry. There will be some growing pains. And I think that, through the actions of myself talking about this on this podcast and all of the other relationships that I have at all of the trade events and all the speaking engagements that I do, that slowly and surely, it's like a super tanker changing direction. They're in kind of a panicky mode at the moment because they know that energy prices are going to be high. They know that there's all this impending legislation come down, and they appreciate that they maybe have been doing things and saying things that are as a result of their immaturity. They will mature, and I think that you'll find we have this conversation in 10 years' time that the entire view will be hopefully somewhat different.
If you're interested in these sorts of ideas, please check out my book, Worldwide Waste, at gerrymcgovern.com. To hear other interesting podcasts, please visit thisishcd.com.